Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the second segment of this part 3 series on China. So we were just finishing off with the great achievements of the Ming Dynasty, and like all dynasties, towards the end they start crumbling due to infighting and intrigue and outside influences as well. So in 1644 of the Christian calendar, a rebel army led by Li Qicheng attacked Beijing, and from the north, that is the Manchu area. And entering the city on 15 April, the last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, hanged himself rather than be captured. On hearing the news of the capital's fall, the army commander from the Ming, Wu Shangyu, stationed at Liaodong in northeast China, decided to allow the Manchu army, which had already fought Ming forces on several occasions in the past and was just then threatening to invade again into China, unimpeded, in the hope they would put down the rebellion. So internal rebellion had actually started within China amongst the Ming, but the Manchu army was allowed in by Wu Shangui. And as it turned out, they didn't just come to help, they took over. And so began the great Qing dynasty from 1644 to 1912. Arif, if you could take us through the rise of the Qing dynasty rather.
Yes, of course. So the Qing dynasty was the last Chinese dynasty and the longest dynasty ruled by foreigners, i.e. the Manchus from Manchuria, which is in the northeast of the Great Wall. It lasted 268 years, and this was the fifth longest imperial dynasty, and it was the second largest Chinese empire. It was an era noted for its initial prosperity and tumultuous final years. The Qing Empire was the most populous empire ever, with a rise in the population from 150 million at the start to 450 million by the end of the dynasty. How did the Qing rise to power? The Qing rise was similar to the rise of the Mongols. Nurhaci, who lived between 1559 and 1626, was a Jurchen or Manchu chieftain who founded his empire in much the same way that Genghis Khan had earlier. Also reminiscent of Genghis Khan, he first defeated a rival coalition of troops in battle. Then he enacted new laws, created a writing system, and adopted advanced military technology and organized the Jurchen and Mongolian tribes to form an effective army. So first of all, he recognized the weakness of the Ming authority north of the border, and he united all the adjacent northern tribes and consolidated power in the region surrounding his homeland, as the Jurchen Jin dynasty had done previously. In 1610, he broke relations with the Ming court, and in 1618 he demanded a tribute for them to redress the 7 grievances. By 1636, Nurhaci's son, Huang Chaji, renamed his dynasty from the later Jin to the Great Qing. He also adopted the Chinese imperial title Huangdi and declared the Chongod revering virtue era, and he also changed the ethnic name of his people from Jurchen to Manchu.
Both Nurhaci and his son had led attacks on the Ming Empire, but they could not get past the Great Wall, and they died in these battles. However, the Manchus were persistent, and a year after the death of Huang Taji in 1644, armies under his son Fulin, who was only 5 years old, conquered Beijing, aided by General Wu Shangui, as I mentioned earlier, of the Ming. He opened the gates of the Great Wall at the Shanhai Pass. Fulin, of course, became the Emperor Shunzhi, reigning between 1644 to 1661. And with the support of his regent uncle Dogon, who essentially ruled on behalf of the child, the new Manchu Qing dynasty was founded. When Dogon died in 1650, Emperor Shunzhi started to rule personally when he was 13 until he died in 1661 at the young age of 24. So Yusuf, just take us through the establishment now and consolidation of the Qing dynasty.
Yeah, so what we find is with the Manchus is that in comparison to the other, they didn't decimate any of the population or Beijing in itself. What they did was actually persuaded the Ming officials and its military prowess leaders in terms of to surrender to them. Because they were a foreign dynasty, sort of controlling that mandate of heaven, which we've spoken about before, was a very daunting task for the Qing. And so the vastness of China's territory meant that there were only enough banner troops to garrison sort of key cities and forming the backbone of a defense network that relied heavily on surrendered Ming soldiers. In addition, 3 surrendered Ming generals were singled out for their contributions to the establishment of the Qing dynasty, ennobled as feudal princes and given governorships over vast territories in southern China. So the chief of these was Wu Sangwei, who was given the provinces of Yunnan and Guizhou, while generals Shang Kashai and Zheng Jingwei were given Guangdong and Fujian provinces respectively.
This was a nice move, but as we'll find later on, it created its own problems in due course. In order to consolidate their hold on the empire in 1645, the Qing decreed that Ming men must shave away their hair apart from Manchu-style pigtails. This hairstyle was humiliating, but it helped the Qing to identify resistors and rebels. I think many of you have seen martial art films. You'll see the difference between the Han period when they had long hair and tied up and the Qing period when they were shaven with just the pigtails. So that's what this is talking about. Traditionally, adult Han people did not cut their hair in accordance to teachings of Confucius, who said, "We are given our body, skin and hair from our parents, which we ought not to damage." And this was held in high esteem by the Han. The Qing edict was, "Keep your hair, lose your head. Keep your head, cut your hair." Very simple and very effective. Tens of thousands who resisted were indeed massacred. Arif, the consolidation was a tough phase, but later on it got better.
Absolutely. So this started around 1652 when Manchu rule was effectively established and the Qing dynasty brought to China more than a century of internal peace and prosperity. There were 3 emperors who, during this period, they proved to be rulers of great vision and ability. The first one was Kangxi, who was there between 1661 to 1722. Yongcheng, who was there between 1722 and 1735. And Qianlong, who was there from 1735 to 1796. And he was the one that led the expansion of the Chinese Empire into Central Asia. Kangxi and Qianlong had the longest reigns in China's history, and Emperor Kangxi reigned from 1654 to 1722, which was 61 years, and Qianlong rule began in 1735 and officially ended in 1796. As mentioned, under the Qing, the territory of the empire grew in treble its size under the preceding Ming dynasty, and the population grew from 150 million to 450 million. Many of the non-Chinese minorities within the empire were Sinicized and an integrated national economy was established. The Qing Empire was the most populous empire, and Beijing was the world's biggest city with over 1 million inhabitants. The Qing Empire was the second largest Chinese empire, and Emperor Qianlong conquered Eastern Central Asia in the 1950s, marked the height of Qing power.
I think it should be 1750.
It is my apology. By which time the empire was 13 million square kilometers or 5 million square miles, and only the Yuan Empire, i.e. the Mongol Empire, was larger at 24 million square miles.
Yeah, the founder of the dynasty, Emperor Shunzi, died at a very young age of 23, 24 with smallpox. So his third son, who was just under 7 years old, was raised to the throne and given the title Emperor Kangxi, meaning peaceful harmony. He had one of the longest reigns, as Arif mentioned, in dynastic Chinese history, ruling for 61 years and responsible for consolidating the Qing Empire and setting the policy direction for future emperors, in fact. Unlike his father, the Kangxi Emperor was keen to bring the whole Qing Empire under central control and so had to face a major rebellion called the Rebellion of Wa Shangui, or the Revolt of the Three Territories. That was the 3 generals who were given, some favoritism for taking over Ming China from 1673 to 1681. The revolt was led by the 3 lords of the fiefdoms in Yunnan, Guangdong and Fujian provinces, which were given to these generals. These hereditary titles had been given to these prominent Han generals, And of course, Kangxi wanted to consolidate everything under his central control. So, Yusuf, how did it end and what happened?
Yeah, so what we find is the revolt ended with the victory of the Qing forces in 1681. And after the last remaining Han resistance was put down, these princely titles that were awarded, they were abolished. And in 1683, the emperor went on to defeat Taiwan as the leader there had supported rebels and incorporated into the Qing Empire. And what we then find is the Kangxi Empire was a highly intelligent and accomplished military leader, and he was known for his physical ability and strength. So to extend and consolidate the dynasty's control in Central Asia, the Kangxi Empire personally led a series of military campaigns against the Zungars in Outer Mongolia. The Kangxi Empire was able to successfully expel Galdan Khan's invading forces from these regions by embarking on very daring and extremely dangerous ventures. A military expedition to Outer Mongolia, across to the scorched Gobi. After this campaign, Outer Mongolia became an integral part of the Qing Empire in 1696. However, the Zungars retained a presence on their eastern borders, and in 1770 they took control of Tibet, and in 1720 Kangxi sent his army into Tibet and expelled the Zungar Mongols from Lhasa and thus incorporate the country into his empire.
Yes, the Kangxi emperor was an exceptionally gifted leader who poured his inexhaustible energy into his daily administrative duties. Under the traditional imperial system of China, nothing in the empire was too small to come under the personal scrutiny of the emperor. Kangxi read all the reports and memorandums presented to him meticulously, correcting even the smallest scribal errors, and he often boasted that he routinely took care of all the documents, even in wartime, when 300 to 400 arrived daily. Just goes to show, really, what important leadership does for a country. He paid particular attention to the problems caused by the Yellow River with the flooding, etc., and the repairs that were needed as well. And this is why the population and the produce expanded massively during the Qing dynasty. Also paid particular attention to repairs of the Grand Canal, which was so important to trade as well, connecting the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. And he was also loved because he reduced taxes, and he was very firm in his drive against corruption as well and government excesses. So there was a lot of respect and love for him amongst the population. And of course, after the conquest of Taiwan, Kangxi lifted restrictions on coastal trade and opened 4 ports, including Guangzhou, which is Canton, the modern Canton, to foreign ships. So trade slowly and steadily started with Europeans, which will come later on. Kangxi was very fond of learning, Arif. Just take us through a little bit more on that.
Yes, it's very interesting. So, his ability for study steadily increased with age. Normally it's the other way around, but actually in his case, as he got older, he wanted to learn more. And even when he was ill from overwork, he did not stop reading books. By 1677, he decided to open a small study hall in the Forbidden City, and he engaged himself in lively discussions and philosophical, historical topics with the leading scholars of the time. He managed to woo the Confucian intelligentsia into cooperating with the Qing government, despite their deep reservations about Manchu rule and loyalty to the Ming. So he actually appealed to this very sense of Confucian values. And an example of this is the Sacred Edict in 1670, which consisted of 16 maxims. Each of these was 7 characters long, and this was to instruct the average citizen in the basic principles of Confucian orthodoxy. And these were publicly posted in every town and village and then read aloud 2 times each month. We don't have time to cover all 16 of them, but if I just cover the first 3, you'll just get an idea and a flavour for what these relate to. So the first maxim was highly esteem filial piety and brotherly submission to give due weight to social relations. The second one was behave generously toward your family to promote harmony and peace. And the third one is cultivate peace within the neighbourhood to prevent quarrels and lawsuits. So you could see here how he was trying to use the Confucian orthodoxy to further his own aims, but also at the same time to promote a harmonious society.
As I said, a truly visionary leader, and in particular he encouraged Confucian learning. He made the civil service examinations as something very, very important for progress and development in the civil services. When some scholars, out of loyalty to the Ming, refused to take the exams, he hit upon the expedient of a special exam to be taken by nomination. He personally sponsored the writing of the Ming Shi, or the Ming official history, the Kangxi dictionary, a phrase dictionary, a vast encyclopedia, and an even vaster compilation of Chinese literature. To promote his image as a sage ruler, he appointed Manchu and Chinese tutors with whom he studied the Confucian classics and worked intensively on Chinese calligraphy. He was again very open to new knowledge and new technologies from Europe as well. Developed and employed relationships with Jesuit missionaries, and he showed them a lot of warmth early on. And the many cultural contributions made by the Jesuits endeared Roman Catholicism to Kangxi, who gave permission for its propagation, which of course later on it was tightened up because of some problems that arose. His sympathy attracted to China more missionaries from such orders as the Dominicans and Franciscans and the Augustinians. In contrast to the Jesuits, who were lenient with such traditional Chinese rites as ancestor worship and the state cult of Confucius and heaven, these newcomers condemned the traditions as superstitious, incompatible with Christian faith, and this was bound to lead to problems. For example, Pope Clement XI sent a papal emissary to China in 1704 to abolish the heretical Confucian rites and report back to on the situation. So in 1707, under papal guidance, those still practicing Confucian rites were to be excommunicated, and this absolutely outraged the emperor. And it's interesting, he wrote back a proclamation in relation to the proclamation of the Pope, and the emperor stated, "Reading this proclamation, I have concluded that the Westerners are petty indeed. It is impossible to reason with them because they do not understand larger issues as we understand them in China. I have never seen a document which contains so much nonsense. From now on, Westerners should not be allowed to preach in China to avoid further trouble." So, well, some would say they asked for it. But, he was very open early on, but he was very annoyed with this move. So Kangxi is usually counted among the ablest monarchs ever to govern the vast Chinese empire. And Kangxi celebrated his long, prosperous reign in 1722, and in December of that year, sadly, he passed away. And his throne was taken over by his fourth son, Xinzan, the Yongzheng emperor. And of course, during his reign, lots of new produce, potatoes and corn from Americas were introduced, etc. So, there were so many contributions. So, Arif, let's get to the next ruler now, the Yongzheng and Qinlong emperors.
Yes, so up to the death of the Kangxi emperor in the winter of 1722, his fourth son, Prince Yong, became the Yongzheng emperor, and he ruled between 1723 to 1735. The reigns of the Yongzheng emperor and his son, the Qinglong emperor, who ruled between 1735 and 1796, these marked the height of the Qing power. After becoming ruler, Emperor Yongzheng moved rapidly to make his mark. He promoted Confucian orthodoxy and reversed what he saw as his father's laxness by cracking down on unorthodox sects and by decapitating an anti-Manchu writer his father had pardoned. In 1723, he actually outlawed Christianity and expelled Christian missionaries, although some were allowed to remain in the capital. The next step he took was to measures to take greater control of the government, and he expanded his father's system of palace memorials, which brought frank and detailed reports on local conditions directly to the throne without being intercepted by the bureaucracy. And he also created a small Grand Council of personal advisors, which eventually grew into the emperor's de facto cabinet for the rest of the dynasty. and he shrewdly filled key positions with Manchu and Han Chinese officials who depended upon his patronage.
The young Zheng Emperor died in 1735, and his 24-year-old son Prince Bao then became the Qianlong Emperor. Qianlong was famed for his 10 great military campaigns. They are famous in Chinese history. He personally led military campaigns as the Qing subdued Tibet and Xinjiang region, taking full control of Mongolia and wiping out the Zungas, which were a large Mongolian tribe of hundreds of thousands. The land area of the Qing Empire was second only, as we mentioned, to the Yuan Empire. So he was very successful in his campaign, certainly in that part of the world, although across with Burma and Vietnam he had more problems. The Qianlong Emperor's reign was the most prosperous in the Qing dynasty, and the population grew quickly to about 300 million. However, foreign trade was restricted to only Guangzhou, which is Canton, at one point, to restrict the foreigners. Later on in his life, unfortunately, the Qianlong Emperor grew greedy. After his victories in the West, he tried to conquer the kingdoms of Burma and Vietnam, as I said, and he lost out very badly and bankrupted the country to some extent. In his later years, he indulged in luxuries, sex and palaces, leaving court matters to corrupt officials. And of course, discontent started growing against Qing rule, and this was really the start of a declining phase. So next phase we call exit the dragon and enter the Europeans, Yusuf, because this is where now China goes down and the Europeans start coming. Just take us through this important phase in a quick summary.
Yeah, so what we see is from the 19th century, the Qing dynasty still ruled over a highly prosperous emperor, but the new emperors were unable to meet the problems caused by a rapidly increasing population, and they had a limited amount of land for agricultural use. The population, like I said, grew massively from 100 million to 300 between 1650 and 1800, and then up to 450 million by the 1850. This constant growth posed obviously problems in terms of how to be fed by ever more intensive cultivation with a limited area. So moreover, China was finding it extremely difficult to counteract the encroachment from the European powers. So during the 18th century, European states benefiting from the great technological and financial revolutions in the West developed economies built on maritime trade, and so started to expand their empires across the world. What we see in 1793 is that the British East India Company, with the support of the British government, sent a delegation to China under Lord George Macartney in order to open free trade, put relations on a basis of equality. The imperial court viewed trade as of secondary interest, whereas the British saw maritime trade as a key to their economy. The Qianlong Empire told Macartney, "The kings of the myriad nations come by land and sea with all sorts of precious things, and consequently there is nothing we lack."
Indeed, in the 18th century, China was still the largest economy in the world, followed by India and with Europe as a secondary player, really. Adam Smith, in fact, still saw China as a great exemplar of, market-based trade. And he wrote, China is a much richer country than any part of Europe, which was truly the case. And unfortunately, the imbalance for the Europeans was such that they were taking goods from China, and all this was being traded for the silver which they held. And as the Europeans started losing the Americas and other colonies, the silver supply became less and less, and they needed to somehow find a solution to this. And as it turned out, unfortunately, one of the solutions that was sought was supply by the British in particular of opium to the Chinese, which they didn't particularly want, but that's what was being sold sort of under the radar, as it was. So Arif, just take us through this phase of where China started getting the phase of humiliation, subjugation.
Yes, as you mentioned, the British realised that they could reduce their trade deficit by counter-trading in narcotic opium. And limited British sales of Indian opium began in 1781, with exports to China increasing as the East India Company solidified its control over India. Obviously, an addiction crisis followed, and whilst the Qing tried a ban outlawing the smoking of opium, British traders continued to work with black marketeers to bypass these laws. And the influx of narcotics reversed the Chinese trade surplus, drained the economy of silver, and increased the numbers of opium addicts inside the country. Outcomes that seriously worried Chinese officials.
Of course, in 1839, the Qing Emperor Duogang asked his officials to stop this opium trade, which they duly did. But then the British sent the Royal Navy and blasted which was called part of the gunboat diplomacy, and that was the start of the first Opium War, where the British didn't take kindly to this, despite the emperor having written to the British royal family that this was not the right thing for the trading nations to do. But this is where the British proved that their technology and gun power, military power, and navy power is much superior. So just take us the Qing surrender in 1842, yes, because the first opium was disastrous for China.
Yeah, so this in 1842 it marked a decisive humiliating blow to China. The Qing dynasty was forced to sign this Treaty of Nanking, the first of what the Chinese later called the unequal treaties, which granted an indemnity and extra territorial British subjects in China. It opened the 5 treaty ports to British merchants and ceded Hong Kong Island to the British Empire. And what we see is that the failure of the treaty satisfies British goals of improved trade and diplomatic relations, which then goes on to lead to the Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860.
And that proved to be even more disastrous for the Chinese, with the British and the Europeans really asking China to sign over Hong Kong and other lands and other rights, etc. It was absolutely a humiliating period. But the growth of opium to China grew massively. I mean, this is a radio program, but you need to see visually the graphs, really. At the end of it, the Europeans were too powerful in the technology they had and the gunboats, the ships they had, etc. And then, of course, this led to several rebellions as well in China. The Taiping Rebellion of 1851 and 1864. Was the first anti-Manchu sentiment and rebellion based on both humiliation by foreigners and mismanagement at home. Probably one of the bloodiest civil wars of all time, with over 25 million people dying in this. Second bloodiest war in history after World War II. This rebellion was led by a Christian Jesuit person who claimed to be a brother of Jesus Christ. So again, multiculturalism caused its own problems in China at that stage. And then later on, of course, China faced many famines where millions and millions died. Over 10 million died due to the famines of northern China, 1876 to 1879. The floods of the Yellow River, again, lost to many millions of lives, etc. So you could see the discontent building up. And then later on, in the 1900s, of course, led to the Boxer Rebellion, which was put down with the help of by the Europeans largely, and the Dowager Empress had gone to support the Boxer Rebellion, and of course that led really to the end of the Qing dynasty, and the last emperor had to go in shame. So I think this brings us to the end of the Qing dynasty. So in concluding the parts, I would say by the late 14th century, the new Chinese dynasty, the Ming, had overthrown the Mongols, and for 200 years it brought order and prosperity to much of China. The population more than doubled, new crops were introduced, industry flourished, and trade greatly increased. China ruled the waves at that time and was the undisputed superpower of the world. Under the Qing dynasty, China doubled in size and experienced 100 years of peaceful prosperity. However, by the late 18th century, rapid population growth and economic decline sparked the repeated rebellions made worse by some of the biggest natural disasters faced by the country. A failure to modernize led to the humiliating defeats against the expanding European and neighboring powers. That brings us to the end of Imperial China. In part 4, we're going to talk about the rise of modern China, and hope listeners will join us. Hope you found this very informative. Again, a plea, please do send us your feedback and listen to our other programs on the Voice of Islam website. Assalamu alaikum.